Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, and I appreciate you guys letting us come and talk to you about it, is just what is a contract portfolio and the fundamentals of setting it up. When we did the assessment before, Jane was clear, it's like, well, we should try to find opportunities to have more term contracts, but how do we explain both the why and some of the how if we haven't done some of it? Because the reality is if that hasn't been part of the repertoire, then how do you really know how to start? So we're just going to do at a fundamental level, how do you deal with that? So you have one handout. By the end of the day, you're going to have 3 plus a case study. Okay, so we just didn't want to overwhelm you guys with information at the first. So this first part, we're talking about both fundamentals and then just planning, where we try to help create some vocabulary on what are we talking about when we're talking about managing a set of contracts and managing them in a category style. Then we're going to talk about sourcing strategies, because you just simply buy in a different way. You set up contracts in a different way when you're trying to set up systems to predict spend, as opposed to just an immediate response to spend that came from an agency. So we're going to talk about several of the different variations of that we've seen, and get you guys to brainstorm on some. And then we're going to talk about, when you do find opportunities, a semi-formal but really a business case type of way to say, hey, there's something different we ought to do in this particular space, and it's important that we keep everybody with us, because especially if you're going to change the way an area is bought, you need to make sure your execs aren't going to fold like a lawn chair the first time that somebody calls in. It's like, are they doing that? Right? So we have to build some case for how we do it. So when we talk about opportunity assessments, I'm actually going to give you guys 3, semi-live examples of opportunity assessments we've either helped build out in a first case or that we're actually currently working. So for the purpose of not wasting paper, I have one that is more tech-oriented, about deliverables-based IT type of a vendor pool. I have one on food, which is more of a commodity style thing, and then I have one on advertising services, which is more service-based. So we're gonna talk fundamentals on why we look to do term contracts and the role that they play in what we're trying to do to create value in procurement. So I've done these kind of presentations both without handouts and with handouts. So since we're doing them with handouts, I'm not going to do my little parlor trick game on this slide, which is, if we didn't have handouts, I'd ask you what you do here, and that would be responded with a dead pause, and then I would turn the call on somebody, and then somebody would say, we buy stuff, right? Or we try to get best value for the agencies, or we try not to get in trouble, or whatever, kind of whatever. So I want to give you our definition of what you do here, which is, we believe that procurement is helping put the people's money to work in a way that upholds people's trust, right? Procurement is an action statement. All that blood, sweat, and tears that our legislators and our leaders put into actually getting money into budgets, it's supposed to do a purpose. Otherwise, we would have given it to somewhere else or given it back to them, right? So we need to think that procurement is about, we're the gateway through which probably 78% of the spend that's actually touching people is going. So, why doesn't it feel that way a lot of times, right? Well, a lot of times the reason that it doesn't end up feeling that way is because procurement will be as churning as we allow it to be. I've also said that after I've done a bunch of different assessments, I've kind of come to the conclusion procurement will be as small as we allow it to be. If we want procurement to just be purchasing and just pick up a rec and move a rec, pick a rec, move a rec, it will be happy to be that. And one of the main reasons why that happens a lot of times is we've built no culture with our agencies on what it means to use our central group, right? We don't have anything that says, how do we work together with you? How do we all work together to advance put the people's money to work in a way that upholds trust? Then procurement ends up being very, very churny. So we don't teach the agencies well about how to work with us. We don't have them adopt our processes in their processes. And then everything is a constant emergency, right? Agencies hold on to stuff until the last second. We don't get it. Then as soon as we get it, it's an emergency. They expect it to be out tomorrow. They don't want to have any conversation about, hey, slow down, let's look at doing a contract, let's do another thing. We haven't built any of those processes. So once everything's an emergency, then all we're doing is juggling. And we're trying to make them happy, and we're trying to not get yelled at, right? And we have contract renewals, we have protests, we have expirations, we have 100 other things. So that's a recipe for being reactive and reactive work. So I know intuitively and inherently, before I even talk to any of you, that you guys know how to enforce this process. and you guys understand the ethics of this profession and your responsibilities and ethics in that profession. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that that's core to what you're doing, or you wouldn't be in this room. And when I know that you know how to take the bid, and it's like, I'm just going to add 3 things to it and push it out the door so that I don't get yelled at. And you know how to keep stuff rolling along. But, do we teach you guys about mission, about what we're trying to accomplish with procurement? And do we know what value is and what we're all trying to drive as a value prop? And if we're trying to say there are opportunities to prioritize what you do so that we're doing the next best, most important thing, do we teach you how about that? And so some of this training is to try to introduce to some of the how on the prioritization effort. So, one way to make procurement feel more like we're in that mission role as opposed to Lucy and Ethel in the chocolate line is to stop cutting the lawn with scissors. And every time that we have a wreck that comes across for a uniform or a school bus or an oven or whatever, that there was some opportunity to take a little bit extra time to help say, what does this represent and how can we make this into a system? How can we make this into something that will be repeated? Every time that we see those, we should look at those and say, can we do something different with that? If all we do is take the wreck and fill the wreck, then that's when we're doing the scissors instead of the lawnmower, right? So I want to be clear, when I talk about doing contract portfolio stuff, there's always going to be requisitions. There's always going to be stuff that is a little outside of what our contract portfolio can do. The little agencies may have something and it's like a particular little thing. So I'm in no way saying we're going to completely blanket every spend in our contract portfolio. But some of those recs do signal an opportunity on how could we do something different with that. So I'm talking to you about, and I'll talk in a second about the value of this group in the sense that you're a finite resource, right? However many of you have, that's all there is. No governor ever does a State of the Union address and says, I need 50 more teachers and 100 more policemen and 35 more buyers, right? So however many of you we have, that's it, right? So how do we capture the value of the time that you spend on things to create systems? So, if we can put it to where we're managing those contracts and the performance of those contracts over a period of time, can we extend the value of what you're doing to locals, right? Jean paid for her entire e-procurement system entirely based on providing service out to locals, right? A lot of times we forget that even if something may only apply to one agency, would that also apply to the buying patterns of our political subdivisions? And, can we pass the lottery test, which used to be the get hit by a bus test, but I was told that wasn't very nice. So if you won the lottery, would anybody know but does anybody around here know how to buy that thing, right? And, if you're indispensable in one area, you can never do anything else, right? There's no opportunity for growth if you're the only person who knows how to buy buses, or you're the only person who knows how to. So I'll tell you somebody I definitely do remember, and that's Lindsay in Philadelphia. So when we were doing an assessment in Philadelphia, out of the execs, I had at least 3 of them tell me, Lindsay is the kind of person we want to be in procurement. We want her to be interested in what this job is, right? We want her to be here. In separate interviews, it's like, that's who you should talk to. So I said, okay, I'm going to go do a desk sit with Lindsay. And I go to Lindsay and I say, tell me what your job is. And she reaches over the wall and she pulls a single piece of paper off and she pushes it over to me and she says, this is my job. And it's a list of the most mind-numbing, microscopic bids you've ever seen in your life. Tasty Cakes, which is apparently a Philadelphia-based Duncan Hines Ding Dong snack cake. Fruit juice concentrate, texturized vegetable protein, or TVP if you're cool, right? Right? And just the most, and on and on and on. And she's like, I roll through this list. I do a 6-month contract for it. I come back around, I start at the top of the list, and I roll through the list again. And she's like, I tell them there should be a better way to buy some of this stuff, but it's like, we'll just buy it the way we did it. And so I'll translate for her, which is, thanks, young person. We'll tell you when you can have an opinion around here, right? Until then, just keep banging out the Tasty Cake bids, right? And so when I went to the execs and the outbrief, I had Lindsay's piece of paper. And I said, you all told me we want her to be interested in procurement. Procurement is a chance. You never have more chance to change government than when you have money in one hand and requirements in the other, right? We should be attractive to young people as far as an opportunity to actually impact the world if we give them the right kind of opportunity to think. And I'm like, this is the job we give her. I'm like, do you want this job? Do you want this job? Nobody wants this job because it's a recipe to crush a soul. It's not a recipe to make somebody be interested in procurement, right? So, but it's not just Lindsay and Philly. I see it all over the place, right? In Missouri, there's a lady who, when I was asking her to describe her job, she's like, 12 bids a year for meat, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, let's roll back to 12 bids a year for meat. Tell me about that. And she says, well, the corrections department wants to make sure that they're getting the best possible price on meat. And so I do a new bid every month for them for 1 month for meat for the prisons for that month. And I said, so if you get sick, there wouldn't be meat in the prisons? And she's like, well, that hasn't happened. And I said, so is it different vendors every time? No. Does the price really move around very much? No. I'm like, could we put them all under contract and tell them that we're going to require them to update their price on a monthly basis and we're going to place an order based on their updating of price and blah, 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 blah? She's like, yeah. I'm like, why don't we do that? What was her answer? It's right in between those two. We've never done it like that, and nobody's ever told me to. Her actual answer was, which is actually even more pathos-inspiring, is nobody ever told me I could do it that way, right? So if we don't tell people we can do it differently, then how are they going to know, right? So if this is the only group that we have, what's the best use of your time? So here's, and it starts to an introduction of when we talk about contract portfolio, what we'd like for you guys to think about, right? So if we think about commonality coming off and to the right, how often we buy something, and complexity coming up and to the top, right? This lower to the left box is an opportunity to think about leveraging catalogs and co-ops. So, another thing Lindsay was buying was replacement lawnmower parts. I forgot that one. I need to add that picture of that to the slide, right? So replacement lawnmower parts, really? Are we really going to do better than Grainger with 20,000 items of replacement? What happens if somebody needs replacement weed eater parts? Does that now mean that Lindsay has a whole new bid? So we can look at how we can leverage those, and I talk about the concern that people have with that and like how to address that concern. And I'm not saying that's the only answer in this low and to the left box. We're going to have recs where it's just going to be onesie twosie and we're going to do them. If we're buying a lot of something, obviously we should be putting it on master contracts. And we talk about in the sourcing strategy that, there are ways to leverage contracts and exclude certain items so that we say we buy a lot of those, so we want those on our paper. But this low to the left box is not strategic. It feels like work, but it's really churn. Okay? So off and to the right, if we're buying a bunch of stuff, then yeah, let's put it under contract. And I would describe that whole lower row as being, when people say, let's get spend under management, I'm sure Gene's heard that phrase 100 times, so has Jane, right? Spend under management. To me, that's saying we want to see most of our commodities bought on a contract so that we can watch it and track it and manage the performance over time. The up and to the left box, where it's an individual agency project, it's a lot of your technology projects, right? It's the high complexity, single agency type project, right? Where that's both the Bermuda Triangle for staff, because it's an impossible box to staff, because you have one of those technology projects. It may take one of your buyers and it's like, bye. In Michigan, they were doing all the work for agencies in that up into the left box. And the CPO said, it was like, I just took a buyer and I just handed it to DMV. And I'm like, well, tell me when you're done with them, right? So it's impossible to staff, number one. Number two, culturally, if agencies don't have an understanding of their responsibility for contract management and contract administration, then all we're doing by helping push them through that box is helping them, in many cases, fail faster. Because most people, no technology project starts out seeking to fail, and yet over half of them end up with cost overruns and in some cases flat abject failure, right? So a contract in that space is not a it's not a finish line, it's a starting line. So we have to build a culture that says, here's how we will help you execute to your box, but you have contract management responsibilities, and we're going to help you, but we're not doing every piece of it for you. But this up and to the right box, right? Isn't that the fourth time I've seen somebody come with a need for a background check service? Or isn't that the fifth time I've seen a case management system? Or is there something in there that we could turn just a little bit and make it anchor tenant, and I'll explain anchor tenant in the sourcing section, to where we can let lots of agencies take advantage of that? That's your ability to create shared services. That's your ability to say, let's take it and move it to where multiple people can take advantage of what you're doing. that up into the right box, it does not happen unless we choose to make it happen. No agency is incented to sit in the up in the right box. And in fact, they're incented in many cases to run screaming away from the up in the right box. Please, God, leave me alone. Please, for God's sake, let me get this bid out the door, right? The only way we can do the up in the right box is if we create a culture that says we're here to work and help you with that, right? And we want to find those opportunities. Plus, it's also saying that down into the right box feels like work, but in many cases it isn't. That up into the right box, we have to choose to want to be in that one. And that's where we talk about transforming through procurement, because that is that opportunity to say procurement can change the way that government works. So when we talk about that contract portfolio concept, and we're going to talk a lot more about that and the methods and so forth, so if you have questions about it, we'll come back to it. So we want to stand up contracts that anticipate needs, right? So we're buying ahead of the rec. We're creating something ahead of the requisition in order to have, methods of delivery that allow that efficiency and quality and consistency of policy, which I'm going to define on the next slide, to rise together. So we want to manage those so when I talk about like a contract portfolio category management mindset, it's saying within our categories, what are the contracts that are there? What are the ones that should be there? A lot of times we have blind spots because we haven't been that contract wasn't just given to us. We have to go make it. And what should we stop doing in that space? A lot of times we have a great deal of contract administration burden in some spaces because there's just one I'm going to talk about as an example. Job order contracting. Some people don't. If you are running the way that you deal with like job orders on small construction type of thing, you might have 1,000 vendors signed up on that. Or you could create a job order contracting method and you have one, right, who's then managing some of those. So what should we be doing? What are we not doing yet? And what should we stop doing? And delivering that value with the minimum complexity to deliver that value. If we were creating 1 million contracts to cover a space that'd be covered with 4, what else would we do with that time? So, a lot of times when I talk about this stuff with folks, it's like, well, we're so busy. We have all this other stuff. We can't possibly do anything new. Well, I would suggest to you have to find time that will help you find time, right? If you are a finite resource and you are a valuable finite resource, we have to have policies and processes that treat you that way, right? And we have to start with the question, what wouldn't happen if central procurement doesn't do it? If you guys don't go in that up in the right box, if you don't look at those opportunities to say, we ought to take that and lift it just a little bit up or change it just a little bit, then it won't happen. So start with the question, what does this group have to do to make it happen? And are we doing those things first? A flip side to that is how do we reduce redundant use of this group in a way that assumes the cost of using you is 0, right? So that corrections example from Missouri, right? That's a terrible consumption of that central procurement group. It literally takes 2.5 people to support the way that corrections by themselves, one agency, wants to buy food. There's a master food contract. They don't want to use it. So they're at loggerheads, to which my response is, well, then let's talk to them about creating a master food contract that is for them and fits this kind of population. Because food is a very complex area to buy, because you're buying food from everything from prisoners to school kids, right? Food is not a single commodity. There is a lot of variation in how it is. And it's like, we have to build that case to do it different. So how do we reduce the use where this group is used in a way that is not a good use of the central group's time? And ultimately, pass that senator in the elevator test, which is that thing about like if we're going to meet the senator and Jane's in the elevator with the senator and they ask, what do you do here question? Does she have an answer? So, you guys seen Office Space? Yeah? Okay. So these are the Bobs from Office Space. I don't remember if I've shown this picture before. If I have, I apologize, but it's a funny picture. So, these are the Bobs from Office Space, and this is the point in the movie where, they basically ask the engineer what he does, and it's clear he's not doing anything when he actually describes the work. So there's that phrase they say, so what is it you'd say you do here? And you got to have an answer to that question. Right? You got to have an answer to that question, and it's got to come from the soul, and it's got to come every time, right? And this is actually something that we worked up several years ago with Jean, and we've, been very appreciative that she hasn't told me to stop using it. So with Gene, it was about how do we use data to drive the thoughts about what we're doing with our contracts. So we've really come to say that procurement stands on a three-legged stool of efficiency, which is how are we helping make sure this process helps stuff get on down the road so that we're putting the people's money to work, right? We can't just sort of sit on stuff for 9 months. That's the number one thing agencies complain about. Quality, what's the quality of our contracts, our quality of availability, the quality of our price, and then consistency of policy. How do we make sure that the policy that's given to us by our lawmakers is consistently applied on the way that we buy? Which is part of the answer to that center in the elevator test of, well, I saw your price on your computers, it was more than the sale over at Target for this thing, so you guys must be terrible, so I might just zero fund your whole agency, right? I mean, those are conversations that happen, right? Well, Senator, that doesn't comply with the new recycling policy that you put in place. It doesn't comply with our MBE policy. It doesn't comply with this, right? We're in a marathon, not in a sprint, right? We're managing over a period of time. And then auto compliance is a bonus win off of this, and I'm going to talk about auto comply in a second, or I'm going to talk about it now. So, when I talk about auto comply, so do you guys have Chipotle's here in Arkansas? Yes. Just got one. Awesome. Okay. So maybe they'll do these ridiculous little making people out of baskets thing that they do in Austin, right? So the top is a Chipotle's basket, and it's made to look like a person, and it says, "Please don't throw away my family. We have a home." And baskets have feelings too. Don't make me an orphan, right? So please don't throw my basket away, right? The bottom is Zoop in Columbus, Ohio. And I eat there a lot because it's around the corner, and that's a tray, and that's the trash can. Can you tell me what you see there?
The trash can hole is too small for the
I can't put the tray in the trash can. So what's more effective? Please don't throw me away, please don't make me an orphan, or make it impossible for me to fail, right? So there's a term from Lean, which is like Lean Six Sigma. You may have heard of these kind of terms, right? So Lean is the one that's associated with basically increasing the velocity through the system, right? So Lean is a Toyota thing. So there's a term called poka-yoke, which is basically, any mechanism which helps the operator avoid mistakes, which is a polite way of saying that's why you can't open your convertible while you're driving down the road at 40 miles an hour and blow your convertible top on the person behind you, because they don't want you making a stupid person mistake that would be easy to fix just by making it impossible for you to make that mistake, right? So when we think about contracts and setting them up, if we understand that, hey, for a particular space, there's something that is unique about the way that's set up. This happens a lot in technology, right? So we might have certain standards in place around, intellectual property or breach or, quality assurance or acceptance or enterprise architecture standards. It could be in other places where we have like recycling standards, like I said. An obvious one for almost every state is either some combination of minority business or local business preferences or veteran preference, whatever, right? So if we understand that as we're bidding for the category and what we put in place is fully aligned, we create it as part of the requirements of how we set up how that pool is going to work, how that system is going to work, then we make it so easy for our agencies to execute, right? Because we're setting up stuff that auto complies with the policy. So if we proactively put things in place that are aligned with that policy and direction, and we don't allow anything on that's not aligned with that, then the contract portfolio becomes the easiest way to get on down the road. I talked before about that efficiency, quality, and enforcement of policy. You can raise all three of those together if you know that they exist and you want to raise them. And you do that through a contract portfolio. Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys, and you can organize however you want. You could be on your rows, you can be across rows or whatever. So I want you guys to take what we've talked about and talk among yourselves about, where have you seen some things that may have any relevance to what we're talking about, right? So you have a couple of options, whatever's comfortable for you, whatever thing you have inside that maybe says, oh, that resonates with what you're saying. So what is something that we would do that hasn't been done if we were putting the big rocks in first. And that's sort of the, if we put the sand in this thing first, we're not going to fit the rocks in. But if we put the rocks in first, we're always going to fit the sand in, right? So the big rocks is those things that only a central procurement group can do. Those kind of group contracts, those kind of term contract stuff. It's real easy when we're swarmed with recs and we're just busy to put off those things that only happen if we choose to make them happen. So let's step back for a second from the biz of the day and just say, is there anything that we would have done if we were truly committed to putting the big rocks in first on what has to happen that the central group has to do? And two is, or, where have you seen some of the thrash in terms of the use of this group where it assumes the use of cost of using you is zero? So like the Missouri story, right? The way corrections was using that group, right? And your Lindsay moment is, it's sort of like the thrash, but it's also that thing where it's, I know we could do it differently, but I can't seem to get any traction, right? So have you had your own Lindsay moment, right? Or do you know of one, right? So what I'd like is, figure out how to get into groups of like 4 or 5, and then pick a spokesperson to report out your best example. And we'll give you guys how are we doing on time? I don't even know. Okay, we'll give you 10 minutes, or a little less than 10, and then report out your best example, and we'll keep going. So I'm going to talk about category management. Okay, so contract portfolio management says we're going to manage a set of contracts as a primary way of trying to do work. So we can't eat the elephant in one bite, right? So we have to break it into pieces. We do that with category management. So category management says we're going to systematically manage certain similar groups or goods and services to deliver that efficiency, quality, and compliance with policy. Senator asked me in an elevator what we do here. Bang, brother, I got it, right? And you guys ought to have it, and whatever y'all's is, it ought to roll up and roll down, right? And we're going to do that through vendor performance and continuous improvement. We're not trying to buy one oven. We're trying to manage the way we buy restaurant supplies. And we're trying to manage it over a period of time so that we improve it consistently. Okay, so visually, when we're talking then about how we start doing that, so at the top, right, we got to get some understanding of our spend. And I realize that, and I'm going to talk about what you do when you're not confident with that spend, right? So obviously, if you're super confident with the spend, this is easy. If you are still working through it, you have to still work through it, but that's what you do. So you have to have some understanding of what your spend is, and then you have to be able to break it into categories, and everybody has to agree what the categories are and how they're going to line up. And then within those categories, right, if you are taking a category management mentality, it's not that you're assigned the 4 vehicle dealer contracts, you're assigned fleet. Right? So it's the categories that are in that space, the categories that aren't there yet that should be, and the ones that should stop being there. So we have to understand in our category first that profile of what is the category, what is the way that we assess opportunity there, how do we think about how we're going to manage that category, which is different than managing an individual bid. We solicit and we optimize. So I define each one of these in the next few. So that first box, that enterprise spend box, we have to know what the financial outlays of the state are, right? Then we have to have some ability to define what's addressable by us, because we're not responsible for everything. Procurement can only affect so much of the spend. We affect a lot of the spend. We don't affect employee salaries. We don't affect, in many cases, we don't affect the capital outlays, like the buildings. We don't affect depreciation. We don't affect debt service, right? So, there's some pieces that we're just going to say that's not affected by us. And then we have to align them into logical and consistent classifications that we're going to use every time, all the time, once we eventually get done with this master data project, right? But we can still use the taxonomy now, even if we don't have the spend data to populate it, right? We just have to choose to act that way. So when I say taxonomy, I've gotten some furrowed brows before, so I'm just going to say taxonomy is basically the science of putting stuff into categories. So when I say taxonomy, that's what it means. And then you apply that category assignment to the way that you organize work and that you assign work to people, right? So it's not, these are your 4 contracts, this is your category, because you need people thinking about not just the the light spots, but the dark spots too, the stuff that we don't have yet, right? So this is just an example, of how we work about hanging taxonomy. If I were actually doing this where this was a project, we would have pages and pages and pages of this, right? But just to give you some sense that we would say, your high level is this animal stuff, and then the breakdown. If we look at fleet, right? Fleet might be automobiles, and then fuel, service and repair, watercraft, vehicle rentals. And the good thing about having a taxonomy that you can sort of see and think about and say, how are we going to break stuff into logical chunks, is if for Arkansas, construction materials should be in a different one because it's associated with the facilities group, you just pick it and lift it, right? But eventually it ought to be, at some high level, here's the category set and here's the subsets, and we're going to look at opportunities and contracts within those. So when we do category analysis then, so we've got that spend, we've defined some of the categories, right? So that we know how we're going to break out work consistently. And so then within those spend categories, how do we identify opportunities to improve our contracts? So if we do have good spend data, right, the kind of stuff that you would naturally pull either in reports and stuff on that is, in the 80-20 rule, what's our big vendors? 80-20 is, most of our spend is going to be in, 80% of our spend is going to be 20% of our vendor kind of stuff, right? So, who are our big vendors? Who are our big agencies? And then, where's our transaction data to say what kind of spend is going on these? I talk about this a little bit more, as well as vendor reports, because in the absence of good spend data, we can always require that our vendors report to us spend against the contracts, and we can just include that as a normal part of our contract term with everybody. I think we talked about that during the assessment set. I don't know if, that still is on the radar, but yeah. Yeah, so whatever it is, in the absence of good spend data, require quarterly reports and mean it and get them, right? I couldn't function otherwise. So those are things that we have if we have good spend. If we don't have good spend data, we're still going to know a lot of stuff, right? It's not like we're sitting around here just in a complete blind spot. We may be in a fog of war, but we're not completely blind, right? So we know our key contracts. We know the kind of requisitions that have been coming across because you guys are already set up to some degree in categories. You may not be as precise as what I was describing, but you may not need to be yet, right? But you certainly are going to know the kind of recs that have come across. You're going to know when agencies are articulating gaps, or you identified some of the gaps in here, right? Areas where you know that certain things could be on contract. And then and then you can easily find out by just picking up the phone and talking to people in peer states or being involved in NASPO or some of the regional things. What are peers doing to try to attack certain areas, right? Figure out who your peer is in Texas who's buying automobiles, or Oklahoma who's buying fuel, and talk to them, because a lot of times it's going to be similar vendors. You may learn you're getting a real raw deal on a price from a same vendor just by having communications, right? So, I was telling Gene earlier that, I had to create a lot more content for this class than I thought I was going to have to, because normally I would spend like an hour and a half talking about how we use spend and how we dig through it. But we didn't want that for this one because we're still working through the data. So instead I tried to do a bunch of extra stuff on what do you do when you don't have spend data, because that should not be the only barrier. So, we're not happy with the data. We can't get anything out of it. It just reminds me of that Churchill quote, democracy is the worst form of government except for every other one that's ever been tried, right? So, it is what it is, right? It has some level of meaning. Ultimately, in my opinion, the best way to make the data better is to actually try to use it, right? And then another good, thing to it is ultimately the only way that we teach agencies that the information they're entering into the spend data matters is to actually try to use it. If you go to if I walk into any random state that hasn't been doing a lot of this, and you pull up their spend for live animals, it's going to be high, because that's one of the first codes in NIGP is live animals. So people will just toggle down one and move on, right? Because we've never taught them that it actually matters. Spend codes only exist for your use, because account codes exist for finance and for our budget people and the rest, right? Spend codes only matter for you. So if you haven't been using them, why do I, as an agency who has a million other things to do, bother with caring what the information that I have in there is, right? So, ultimately, when we work the data, like let's say you do a poll at whatever level it is today. Say I want to have a poll of our spend on vehicles, right? Or printers or whatever. When we pull the data and we say this doesn't reconcile with my opinion on what we would actually be doing in it, and you actually try to work it, there's one or two things that happens with it, and they're both usually positive, right? One is there actually is an opportunity, and we're going to go build a business case and do it. Another is we uncover, an egregious flaw in the way the data is being set up, and we can go chase that and fix it. So and I call it bubble in the data, kind of like a bubble on the wallpaper that you have to chase with one of those little, the best example of this was from Gene, right? So when we proposed to Gene, there was a particular area that when we were doing some stuff for Gene where we said, we think it's here, y'all's team said, that's not really there. And when we looked in the data, there was one buyer at like Parks and Wildlife or somewhere who just blatantly didn't care to actually enter the spend data in the right way, right? So one buyer was almost like unilaterally causing all the data to mess up, right? But that's actually about an outcome, right? We know Sally needs to give a crap, right? And we're going to go talk to Sally, right? I mean, so that's valuable, right? So if it's caused by the system, right? Hey, I can't pull this kind of thing, and here's a specific thing that really gives Paul and Jenny in this group like ammo to go try to say, hey, I got to have a sense of urgency to get this stuff fixed, right? This isn't just some abstract academic request that I sort of kind of want something better because, in some metaphysical way, better is better, right? It's like my folks need this stuff to work, right? So if we try to use the data, the best time to have done all this stuff is 5 years ago. The second best time is today, right? So we have to be able to try to use the data to do work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what you would do with spend data if you had it, but I'm not going to hit it as hard as I normally would in some of the training. But this mindset doesn't need spend data to work, right? If we don't have it, we still can get in that mindset. We know categories. We can establish categories. We can assign and organize our contracts into categories for the purpose of assignment, as long as we agree to the groupings in the taxonomy. And we can require and leverage vendor reporting within those categories to be able to build a base of information, right? If you already culturally have a requirement from vendors, they have to report spend information to you. As long as you have stuff in the categories and you have somebody consistently saying, I need it. I was in New Mexico yesterday and I was meeting with some of their folks, and they basically have let the requirements to both report and pay the admin fee just kind of, and they've kind of like, whoa, this is a problem. And so now they have a compliance person who is now sending out things saying, hey, I've calculated out your fee, and here's the last time I got a report, and I need it. And pop. And then there were like 35 that were still saying they hadn't. They sent him a 4-clause letter saying, hey, I said I need it. Right? I mean, so if you got somebody who's kind of on it and says this is important, and in the absence of my confidence with ACES, I got to have this, you can do it. So ultimately, though, it's really locked in that mindset that we're looking for what's there, what's not there, and what should be there, and not just these are my 4 contracts. Okay? So that was category profile, building a profile in a category. So then opportunity assessment, it says once we identify an opportunity, and we can use like vendor, stakeholder input, available data, then we need to be able to research whether that opportunity is real or not. Right? So in Ohio, we're doing some opportunity assessment work where, I've tried to consistently reemphasize we are not necessarily on a procurement path on these given things. What we're doing is we're helping the buyer learn how to make those kind of critical assessments about we should be doing something different so that we can take it to the CPO and say, here's in a synthesized way why we ought to be buying furniture different or why we ought to be buying this different. And here's some of the benefits and ramifications. We're going to look at a couple of those examples. So it captures the research and it builds a business case for change, especially if the way to change something, could create political spin, either by changing, really kind of impacting our vendor mix or challenging the interpretation of a law or whatever. Got to get it in a piece. In that case in Missouri, with the way that corrections is buying food, we're never going to change that relationship just by going and saying, I would prefer not to do this work, because then they're just going to say, isn't that your job, right? Instead, we have to be able to say, here's how, instead of continuing to buy the way that you're choosing to buy, I can create something for you that has lasting value. It also will help our political subdivisions because they all have jails and they all have the rest, right? And I can make it so you can go faster and get everything that you're expecting and save my group time. But you got to put it in a thing, right? You can't just sort of wing it, right? So that's what opportunity assessments are for. They're used to prioritize and drive work. You don't have to do an opportunity assessment every single time, but if you're doing something new, I suggest doing them. So,
and one other thing real quick.
Yeah.
Like you're in a category that you're not familiar with, or it's a new area and you're trying to learn and you're having to interact with vendors, it's also a really great way to capture what you're learning from vendors in a way that's transparent. If somebody comes in and goes, oh, well, you talked to so-and-so and they guided you. I got this opportunity assessment that says I got all this information together and I made a decision out of it. So it's a really good way to sort of CYA with all the vendor transparency stuff.
Okay, and then performance planning. So if we're just buying an oven, we're going to get the oven, right? We're going to buy it, we're going to turn it. We don't have to manage performance, right? It came, we got it, check, triple match, we're done. If we're buying predictively, right, or we're setting up different contracts, sometimes we're going to use different tools on how we actually manage that, how we judge performance. Because some of the times some of the times you may let a lot of people in on the first one because you don't want to deal with the heat of like, oh, you shut down my business. And then once you actually see, half of the vendors on there have 0 sales, then you can start rolling them off. And then they're like, oh, I really want to stay on. It's like, okay, well, here's what it means to stay on, right? And so but you got to say those things up front so that you can enforce it on the back. So how do we manage performance in the system? So also things that would deal with how you would deal with performance is thinking ahead to how do I want agencies to access these services in this contract? In the sourcing strategies part that we'll do after the break here in a second, we'll talk about 2-step vendor pools, which is a way of sort of having the SOWs come through you first for particular purposes. So sometimes you may want to say, agencies, y'all go do whatever you want with these contracts. Or, hey, I have a particular process I want you to use in order to use those contracts, right? So thinking ahead to how do I want the system to work that I'm creating through the contracts? How do I want vendors to report on it? And what kind of performance measures will vendors have to execute to in the category? So you have to think about that before you go run off and do a bid, because it's very hard to retrofit that, right? And we do a lot of bids where basically what we're presenting to vendors is a system that we want to establish through a set of contracts, and they know that as they're signing up. So solicit an award, basically what we're going to talk about that in the next section is, some of the ways that you would attack some of these opportunities, like the way that I would suggest that you attack print. It's going to be a little different than the way that you might normally contract for stuff. I'm not trying to disparage in any way the normal process of doing things. I'm just saying sometimes on these, we have more than one tool in the toolkit, right? And that's what we're going to talk about in the section is just what are some of the ways to actually assemble work so that it works that way. So we're going to cover it more in depth after we take a break here in the next couple slides. And optimized means we're setting up the contract, but then now that we're not watching the individual bid for the oven, we're managing the restaurant supplies bid. How are we going to track the usage of that, and how are we going to optimize and say what's the best next time? So it's a shift. It's a shift in just saying we're managing and constantly improving our contract portfolio set. Okay, so what we've covered so far is just some fundamentals on why term contracts fits into the philosophy and strategy of a procurement group, and then gave you some definitions on spend and category management. If you guys have any questions, we'll deal with them. After that, we'll take a break, and then when we come back, what we're going to specifically talk about is several of the ways that we've seen people try to source a little differently, some of the strategies that we've seen and we've employed that I think will be interesting to you guys.